The stars used to be our dream. Every child who looked up at the night sky once imagined adventure, wonder, discovery. Humanity stretched its hands toward the heavens, building ships of fire and steel to chase those stars. We thought the universe would welcome us. We thought we would find friends among the constellations. We were wrong. The first ships came without warning. Vast black shapes blotting out the sun. The Vakar. They were not explorers. They were hunters. Not of planets, not of resources, but of people they did not come to conquer. They came to erase. Cities died first. Their weapons weren't like ours. No smoke, no fire, no thunder. They used waves of sound that tore buildings apart, turning towers into dust. They released storms that boiled the oceans, turned rivers into poison, forests into ash. The proudest achievements of humanity, our bridges, our satellites, our monuments, all reduced to fragments in a matter of weeks. And then came the hunting. The Vakar did not stop with our homes. They came for us, every man, woman, and child. Their ships scoured the skies, their machines stalked through ruins, their scouts moved with silence and precision. They found us wherever we hid. There was no negotiation, no demands, no mercy. Only extermination. We tried to fight back. Nations rallied their armies, navies, and air forces. Missiles rose to the skies. Warships filled the seas. For a brief moment the world seemed united, but against the Vakar unity meant nothing. Their armor deflected our strongest weapons. Their ships slipped past our defenses as though they weren't even there. Entire battalions vanished in flashes of light. We struck them again and again, but every victory we thought we had was an illusion. Humanity bled. And the stars that once gave us hope, now watched in silence as we were hunted to the edge of extinction. Imagine this. New York silent, its towers nothing but skeletons of steel swaying in the wind. Tokyo drowned beneath rising seas, Cairo a desert of glass, and the voices of billions. Gone. In less than a year, 90% of humanity was ash, scattered across a broken earth. But here is the truth the Vakar never understood. Humanity has never survived because of strength. We have survived because of something far more dangerous to our enemies, our refusal to surrender. Even as the hunters searched the globe, even as our civilizations crumbled, there were those who slipped through their grasp, scattered, bleeding, desperate, but alive. Among them was Mara, a soldier who had once led only a handful of troops. When her city fell, she carried not just her weapon, but a promise that humanity would not end on her watch. She found others, engineers, doctors, children who had lost everything. Together they ran into the earth, burrowing into tunnels beneath the frozen crust of Iceland. There, in the dripping caverns of stone, humanity took its first breath after the fall. They lived like ghosts, rationing crumbs of food, sleeping to the sound of distant thunder as Vakar ships scoured the surface. Each day someone asked the question no one dared to answer. Why us? Why do they hate us so much? But Mara never gave them despair. She gave them fire. We are still here, she told them. That is enough. And so the fall was not an ending. It was the beginning of a different story. A story not of victory, not yet, but of survival. Because even when hunted to extinction, humanity refused to die. The Vakar thought they had erased us. But in the shadows, in the silence, in the broken heart of the world, we endured. And one day we would rise. Beneath the shattered surface of Earth, far from the burning skies, humanity found its fragile sanctuary. It wasn't a city. It wasn't even a home. It was a network of caves, jagged tunnels carved by fire and ice beneath the frozen crust of Iceland. There the survivors gathered, scattered fragments of a broken species bound by one truth. They were all that remained. The world above was unrecognizable. Seas boiled. Skies were filled with the thunder of Vakar patrols. Ash and ruin blanketed once living lands. Every hour their ships rumbled across the heavens, hunting with patient, merciless precision. But down in the caverns, there was still breath. There was still light. There was still us. They came from everywhere, engineers, farmers, children, and warriors. Some had crawled out from ruins. Others had fled firestorms that consumed their homes. Each one carried scars, Each one carried grief. And yet together, they carried something else. Survival. At the heart of it all stood Mara. She was not the strongest, not the loudest, but she had what the others had lost. Direction. Once a soldier, she now led by the weight of her silence, the steel in her eyes. She carried memories of battlefields, of friends left behind, and of promises never broken. When she spoke, people listened. Her words were simple, but they cut through despair like a blade. We are still here. That is enough. In the damp darkness of the tunnels, they built a fragile routine. Fires lit with scraps of wood and fuel. Crops grown in shallow patches of soil, nourished by dripping mineral water. Tools crafted from wreckage scavenged above, when they dared risk the surface. It was not life as they once knew it. But it was life, and yet fear never left them. The sound of engines above made hearts freeze. The ground itself seemed to tremble with the presence of hunters. Children were taught silence before they learned letters. Babies were swaddled in blankets not to keep them warm but to muffle their cries. Still, there were moments of laughter, rare but real, a joke whispered in the dark, a song hummed from memory, the sharing of stories, grandparents speaking of a time when the sky was clear, when humans touched the stars not in fear but in wonder. For the youngest, these were only tales. For the elders, they were wounds. One night, as shadows stretched across the cavern walls, a boy named Eli asked the question that had been buried in everyone's hearts. His voice was small, but it carried through the chamber. Why do they hate us so much? Silence fell. No one moved. No one spoke. The question had no answer. None that could heal. None that could make sense of the endless cruelty of the Vakar. Finally, Mara knelt beside him. She placed her hand on his trembling shoulder and said words that became a creed, a shield, a promise. They want us to disappear. That is why we must remain. And so the people clung tighter to life. Every day became a ritual of survival. Hunters searched the surface for food, knowing each step could be their last. Engineers patched old machines with desperation, turning relics into tools. Doctors healed wounds with scraps of cloth and whispers of hope. Each night, they returned to the cavern with what little they had, sharing it equally, no matter the hunger gnawing at their own stomachs. It was not hope that kept them alive. Hope is fragile. Hope shatters. What kept them alive was something harder, sharper: defiance. When the Vakar roared above, when ash fell like snow through cracks in the stone, the survivors whispered to one another, "We are still here." That is enough. And in that defiance, something began to grow, something dangerous, something the Vakar had never accounted for. Because in the heart of despair, in the silence of extinction, humanity was learning a truth older than fire. We endure. And though they did not yet know it, the refuge was not just a hiding place. It was a beginning, the first ember of a fire that would one day set the stars ablaze. In the deep tunnels of Iceland, life was measured not in days but in breaths. Each breath stolen from extinction. Each breath a reminder that humanity still existed. The survivors had fire, they had food, they had silence. But silence can be as deadly as hunger. In silence, despair grows. In silence, memory fades. It was Cade who first broke that silence. He was no soldier, no leader, just an engineer with hands scarred by work and eyes haunted by loss. Before the fall, he had repaired satellites and dreamed of starships. After the fall, his tools were broken, his schematics ash. But in the caverns, Cade's mind would not rest. Every scrap scavenged from the surface passed through his hands: shattered drones, twisted metal, shards of old transmitters. To others, they were worthless junk. To Cade, they were puzzle pieces. Night after night, he sat alone in the flickering firelight, soldering wires with scavenged heat, pressing circuits together with calloused fingers, whispering to machines as though coaxing life back into corpses. At last, he brought his creation to Mara. It was small, fragile and flickering with uncertain power, but to Cade it was everything. A beacon, he said. His voice trembled, half in pride, half in fear. It can reach the stars. Mara studied it, her eyes narrowing. She understood at once the weight of what he had done. Around them whispers grew, The survivors gathered close, staring at the fragile device. For the first time in years, something new glimmered in their eyes, not fear, not grief, but wonder. Yet fear returned quickly. "If they hear it," one voice said, "they'll finish us." "If it reaches the wrong ears, we're doomed," said another. "We've survived by staying silent," whispered a third. "This will kill us all." They were right. The beacon was a risk. A single signal could betray their hiding place. It could draw the hunters straight into their sanctuary, but silence was its own kind of death. Silence erased names, erased memories. Silence was what the Vakar wanted. Mara held the beacon in her hands, feeling the faint hum of power beneath its surface. She looked at the frightened faces of her people, faces lit by firelight and fear, and she spoke. "If we live in silence," she said, "we are already finished." Her words struck the cavern like thunder. The people trembled, torn between terror and longing, and then a sound, a hum rising from the beacon, a pulse faint but steady. Cade's voice broke as he explained, "It won't just call for help. It carries memory, fragments of who we were, songs, images, words, reminders that humanity lived." The cavern fell into stillness. In that moment they understood. This was not just a call. It was defiance, a refusal to vanish quietly. At Mara's nod, Cade activated the beacon. A thin wave of light surged through the device. A signal, weak but determined, leapt from the caverns into the sky. It cut through ash, pierced clouds, slipped past the silent wrecks that drifted in orbit, and then it went further, out, beyond, into the vast unknown. The survivors held their breath. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The world was still, silent, empty, and yet deep in their bones they felt it. The spark had left the earth. Humanity's voice had returned to the stars. Tears slipped down weathered cheeks. Children smiled without understanding why. Elders pressed hands to their hearts, remembering songs long forgotten. It was dangerous. It was reckless. But for the first time since the fall, it was life. Above, the hunters prowled. Their ships swept across the skies, listening, searching, and somewhere in the dark of space the signal echoed, a whisper in the void. "We are still here." The people did not know if anyone would hear it. They did not know if it would save them or destroy them, but they knew one thing: humanity was no longer silent, and silence had been the hunters' greatest weapon. The Vakar believed they had erased us. But now the stars themselves carried our defiance, and with that single spark the fire of resistance had begun. The beacon sang. Its voice, faint yet unbroken, drifted into the void, and the void answered. But it was not salvation that came. It was the hunters. The Vakar heard the signal. They descended upon the ruins of Earth with renewed fury. Their ships, dark as midnight, swept across the skies like shadows with claws. They carved fire into the land, tore open mountains, and shook the seas with thunder. The ground itself trembled as if the planet feared their wrath. In the caverns of Iceland, the survivors felt the tremors in their bones. They knew at once the beacon had been heard. Humanity was discovered. Fear rippled through the tunnels. Some cursed Cade for his creation. Others cursed Mara for her choice. And yet, beneath the anger lay a sharper truth. The hunters would have found them eventually. The signal had not doomed them. It had simply hastened the inevitable. The time of hiding was over. When the Vakar broke the surface above, tearing open the frozen crust, the survivors did not run. They prepared. The tunnels became their battleground. Engineers shaped rubble into traps. Hunters laid snares in narrow passages. Old drones were fitted with explosives, turned into predators of their own. Every scrap of steel, every shard of glass, every broken fragment of the old world became a weapon. And so, when the Vakar descended into the earth expecting prey, they found resistance. The first hunter stepped into darkness and the floor beneath it collapsed. Jagged spikes of steel hammered together by desperate hands tore through its armor. Its death cry echoed through the tunnels. Another entered cautiously, but the walls came alive with fire. Humans leapt from shadows, blades sparking against alien plating. Rifles scavenged and modified to punch through weak points. The hunter fell and another took its place and another after that. The tunnels became a maze of death. Humans who once tilled fields, who once drove buses, who once sang in concert halls, now fought like wolves. Eli was among them. The boy who once asked why had grown tall enough to carry a weapon. His hands trembled as he lifted the scavenged rifle, but his eyes burned with fire. When the moment came, when a hunter's silhouette loomed in the dark, he squeezed the trigger. The weapon roared. The hunter fell. And Eli, though his chest shook and tears stung his eyes, whispered to himself, "We are still here." The Vakar could not comprehend it. By every calculation, humanity should have been finished. We had no armies, no fleets, no cities. We were broken fragments scattered in the dirt. And yet in the very dirt itself we struck back. For every human that fell, a hunter was dragged into the abyss beside them. For every scream there was a roar of defiance. Mara fought at the front, her blade striking with the precision of memory, her voice a rallying cry. She reminded them with every shout, with every swing, "We do not die quietly." The battle raged for hours, hours that stretched into eternity in the suffocating dark. Blood stained the tunnels, both human and alien. Smoke choked the air. The walls themselves seemed to scream with every explosion. And still, humanity endured. When at last the hunters withdrew, the survivors stood among their dead and their wreckage, trembling but alive. The victory was small, temporary, costly, yet it was a victory. The beacon had not just drawn enemies. It had awakened something inside humanity. Something the Vakar had thought they had burned out of us. We remembered. We remembered how to fight. We remembered how to hunt. And as the survivors gathered in the silence that followed, Mara spoke words that etched themselves into every heart. They came for us as predators. They left as prey. Let them remember that humanity is never finished. Not while one of us still breathes. The tunnels echoed with weary cheers, with sobs, with trembling laughter. For the first time since the fall, humanity had not only endured, we had struck back. The hunters believed the war was over, but the hunt had only just begun. The tunnel smelled of smoke and blood. The dead were buried in silence, their names whispered like prayers. Each loss was a wound, each wound a scar, but humanity carried scars well. Scars became stories, and stories became strength. Cade worked tirelessly among the wreckage left by the Vakar retreat. While others sharpened blades or tended wounds, he scavenged. His hands moved with quiet desperation, pulling fragments of alien armor, cracked devices, shards of their comms. To the untrained eye, it was debris. To him, it was revelation waiting to be uncovered. He studied night and day, his eyes red, his fingers trembling. And then, he found it. The first crack in the hunter's silence. He captured fragments of their language, broken transmissions carried on frequencies the beacon had brushed against. At first they were nothing but hisses, guttural tones and shrieks of static. But slowly, painfully, Cade began to decode them. Each sound was a thread, each pattern, a clue, and what emerged was more terrible than he had imagined. The Vakar were not hunting humanity because of territory, or resources, or even hatred. They were hunting because it was their way. Their records, scraps of data buried in encrypted layers, spoke of entire civilizations before us. Hundreds of them. Thousands, perhaps. Worlds teeming with life. Worlds that had once dreamed as we had dreamed. All of them gone, burned, erased. The Vakar called it purification. To them, intelligence was a contagion. Creativity, memory, and defiance were plagues to be stamped out. They believed only silence should remain in the universe. Silence. And themselves. When Cade shared his findings, the cavern fell into a hush colder than any winter. Faces turned pale. Children clutched their mothers. Elders closed their eyes as though hearing the funeral bell of the cosmos. But Mara did not flinch. Her voice was steady, her eyes fierce. "They call us a contagion," she said. "Then let us be the contagion they cannot kill." Yet hidden deeper in the data, Cade uncovered something else. Something that made the hunter's cruelty tremble with irony. Long ago, before humanity rose, another species had resisted. They had fought with such ferocity, such unyielding defiance that the Vakar had never forgotten. Though they had been destroyed, their rebellion left scars. scars etched into the hunter's very memory, and now, the records whispered of fear. The Vakar did not fear weapons. They did not fear armies. They feared what could not be erased: memory, defiance, the refusal to vanish. Cade's voice shook as he spoke, reading from the alien records. They fear us. Because we remember, because we refuse silence, because we do not die quietly. The cavern stirred, heads lifted, eyes burned. What had begun as despair now kindled into something else, something sharper. The survivors were no longer just hiding from extermination. They were carrying the same fire that had once scarred the hunters. They were inheriting the defiance of every species erased before them. Mara raised her voice so all could hear, her words echoing through the stone. Do you understand what this means? We are not the first they have tried to erase, but we may be the last. If we fall, silence wins. But if we endure, if we fight, not only for ourselves but for all who came before, then the hunters will fail. They will remember us, and so will the stars. Her words struck like lightning. For the first time, the survivors did not see themselves as victims. They saw themselves as inheritors of a legacy, a chain of defiance stretching across forgotten ages now burning in human hands. Eli, his voice no longer trembling, stood and declared, "Then let us be their scar." And so it was decided. The beacon would not just call, it would carry their memory. Every story, every song, every name of the fallen would be etched into its signal. Humanity's voice would not be silence, it would be a storm. The Vakar had believed they were erasing history. Instead, they had created its fiercest guardians. The revelation spread through the cavern like fire. Fear remained, yes, but fear had become fuel. Anger became resolve. And for the first time since the fall, the survivors no longer whispered if they would endure. They whispered when they would rise. The hunters thought the war was nearly over. But the truth was dawning. The war had only just begun. The hunters had retreated, but their shadows still loomed over Earth. Their ships carved across the skies, watching, waiting, ready to descend again. Yet something had shifted. In the tunnels of Iceland, the survivors were no longer prey. They were wolves learning to bare their teeth. Cade and his team worked tirelessly, repurposing fragments of alien tech. Armor plating became shields. Energy cells, once used to power the hunters' rifles, now fueled human-made traps. Circuits, rewired with trembling hands, hummed with a dangerous promise. Every day Mara walked among them. Her presence was steady, her gaze unyielding. She carried not just her rifle, but the weight of every decision. She knew the hunters would return, and when they did, humanity could no longer afford to only endure. They had to strike back. It began with whispers of raids, small, desperate strikes at Vakar patrols. A group of survivors, armed with stolen rifles and sharpened blades, would emerge from the earth, hit fast, and vanish into shadows before the hunters could respond. At first, the raids were clumsy. Mistakes were made. Lives were lost. The Vakar underestimated them once, then twice, but no more. They adapted quickly, hunting harder, striking back with merciless precision. Yet so did humanity. Every failure was a lesson. Every death a teacher. The survivors learned the hunters' rhythms, their tactics, their weaknesses. The tunnels became a living map of war, marked with drawings of patrol paths, sketches of alien armor, notes scribbled in the dirt, and soon, the raids turned into victories. Trains carrying supplies for the hunters were derailed, their wreckage consumed by fire. Patrols vanished into ambushes, their screams echoing into the night. Human-made explosives toppled alien walkers, shaking the ground with triumph. The world began to shift. The ruins, once silent, now whispered with resistance. And then came Eli. No longer a boy, but not yet a man. He found his voice in the fire. He began broadcasting messages across the airwaves, hijacking fragments of alien comms, speaking into the void with a voice steady beyond his years. He did not only send warnings or call out coordinates. He sent stories, songs, words of defiance. "We are the memory you cannot kill," he said, his voice carried across broken lands. "We are the fire that does not die. His broadcasts reached more than human ears. Scattered survivors across the world, hidden in deserts, mountains, and broken cities, heard the call. They rose. They fought. Humanity, once fractured and silent, began to move as one again. The Vakar noticed. For the first time, hesitation flickered in their movements. Their patrols grew heavier. Their searches more desperate. Hunters who once stalked without fear now moved in packs, glancing at shadows. The predator had tasted fear. One night, after a successful raid, Mara stood before her people. Her armor was scorched, her hands stained with battle, but her eyes shone with unshakable fire. "Do you see it?" she asked them. "They bleed, they fear. They can be broken." The cavern erupted in cries, not of despair but of determination. Humanity had become more than survivors. They were warriors, guerrilla fighters. A storm rising from the ashes. The hunters had hunted us to extinction. But extinction was not what they found. They found a fire reborn. For every star that burned in the night sky, a human voice now rose in defiance. For every hunter that prowled, a trap waited. For every shadow cast by their ships, humanity's fire grew brighter. The Vakar had come to cleanse, to erase. Instead, they had awakened something they could not silence. Humanity was no longer hiding. Humanity was returning. And the fire was spreading. The war was far from over. The skies above Earth still burned with the shadows of Vakar ships. Cities still lay in ruins. Oceans still carried scars of fire. And every day the hunters searched for the remnants of humanity. But something had changed. For the first time since the fall, the hunters hesitated. Their patrols moved slower. Their formations were heavier, tighter. They no longer stalked the ruins with the cold arrogance of predators certain of their prey. No, now they glanced at shadows. Now they feared the silence they once commanded, because the silence no longer belonged to them. It belonged to us. From the tunnels of Iceland to the deserts of Africa, from the mountains of Asia to the wrecked coasts of the Americas, whispers spread like wildfire. Survivors who had thought themselves alone heard Eli's broadcasts. His voice, steady, unwavering, rose above the static of broken machines. "We are humanity. We endure storms, we endure fire, we endure death itself. You may hunt us, but you will never erase us. We are still here." And across the ruins of Earth, humanity answered. Scattered cells became armies. Broken tools became weapons. Every ruin, every street, every fallen city became a battlefield where traps were laid and ambushes struck. The Vakar, once the unstoppable hunters, found themselves bleeding under 1,000 tiny cuts. We could not match them ship for ship, gun for gun, but we did not need to. We had something they could not understand. We had memory. We had defiance. We had the fire they thought they had extinguished. Mara stood atop a cliff overlooking the shattered sea. Around her, survivors gathered. Farmers turned fighters, children turned messengers, engineers turned inventors. Their faces bore scars, their eyes carried grief. But behind it all burned a light that no weapon could dim. She looked to the horizon, where alien ships glimmered like false stars, and she spoke words that would be remembered for generations. They hunted us to extinction. But extinction is not our destiny. We are humanity. We endure, we rise, and one day the stars will not remember the hunters. They will remember us. Her words spread like lightning, carried on Eli's broadcasts, etched into every survivor's heart. And with those words, humanity was no longer hiding. Humanity was no longer prey. We had become the scar the Vakar feared. Yes, the war still raged. The hunters still held the skies. Their power still dwarfed ours, their fleet still stretched across the stars. But something irreversible had happened. Humanity had refused to vanish. Humanity had refused silence, and that refusal was more powerful than any weapon. Because the Vakar could destroy cities, but they could not destroy memory. They could silence voices, but they could not silence defiance. They could kill humans, but they could not kill humanity. Not while one of us still drew breath. Not while one story was still remembered. Not while one child still whispered into the dark, "We are still here." The stars had witnessed our fall. Now they would witness our rise, and so the war for Earth did not end in silence. It began in fire. Humanity was not finished. Humanity would never be finished. Because humanity refused to die.